Okay, I'm supposed to start this morning, and for those of you who don't know me, maybe you're not old enough. My name is Nicholas Negroponte. I was the co-founder, or I am the co-founder of the Media Lab. And I want to tell you a very quick story. When we started the Media Lab in the late 70s, the question was, what would you call it? What was the name? And I remember going to a meeting of the rather higher-ups of the institution, and they said, Nicholas, there are two words you cannot use: computers and communications. You can use any other word. And I said, how about media? And they said, you mean like newspapers and magazines? And, and I said, yeah. And they said, yuck, it's all yours. And so we ended up calling it the Media Lab, and we felt that part of our mission was to cleanse the word, to expand the word, to take the word and have it mean a lot more than it did in 1979, 1980, where it tended to mean things like Madison Avenue. It tended to mean sort of mass media only. It had a lot of connotations which there's no reason for you to know or remember. And in doing that, over the next 25 years, it expanded so rapidly that it included life sciences, as you know, it included the arts, it included many, many different pieces. And when we were searching recently for a new director, the challenge was to find somebody who was at once broad enough, new enough, young enough, and selfless enough. The last two are actually usually contradictory. You don't find young, selfless people in this world. It's harder. You have to be of a certain age to get to that point. And we found one. And it's Joey Ito, who has been our director officially for a month or something, and maybe 6 weeks. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce him, and he will then introduce the day. And I think you will see over the next few years a whole different view of what media and the Media Lab is. So with that, Joey, it's yours.
Thanks, Nicholas. Thank you, everybody. As Nicholas said, I just started, and it's amazing sort of joining this family that's the Media Lab. It feels like either that I've been here forever or it's a long-lost tribe. It's also a lot like marrying into a big family. First you meet the little house, and then you meet the relatives. And now this meeting is wonderful because this is the whole extended village. And I think that the idea of this community of people around the Media Lab is an essential one that we'll talk more about. But also sort of interacting with Nicholas has been a real pleasure over the last actually couple of months, thinking about the Media Lab and where it started 25 years ago, before there was no internet, before there wasn't really the PC revolution we've had, and how the Media Lab has reinvented and created all of these things in the past and started all these bandwagons that are going crazy right now. But then thinking about, okay, what do we do 25 years from now? And that's a really interesting, important challenge. And I think that the world has changed a lot. But the fundamental DNA of the Media Lab, the fundamental idea that Nicholas and his team had when they put it together, I think remains extremely relevant. And I think that as the world becomes more complex, it actually almost is more relevant and important, because I think that if you think about it, almost, and this is sort of cliche, but almost every important thing, good or bad, that's happened recently was completely unanticipated and unplanned. And as you will see from the Media Lab, it's this, and John C. Brown talks about this a lot, there's a big difference between serendipity and randomness. And how can you create a process that pushes you from what looks like random things to something that's serendipitous? And how do you embrace this kind of openness so that you can predict and be involved in things that are going to happen in the future? Because it turns out planning isn't the way to predict the future. Something like the Media Lab process is. And so we're trying to figure out how do we apply this to more and more things. And so when we were, actually, I guess I can say this because it was okay. We had a faculty retreat. Actually, before I officially started, so I was a volunteer participant in the faculty retreat. And one of the things that it was an amazing retreat where we were all there talking about the future of media and talking about the word media and Nicholas explaining where it came from and us talking about where it was going. And one of the key things that we realized was that this whole notion of participation in networking was much more important than it was 25 years ago. But that the word media, and Nicholas's choice, was perfect, because you could still, just like Tim Brown calls the whole world a design problem, just about anything. We have gene sequencing and automobiles are media in our context of the word media. And so thinking about the future of the word media, thinking about the importance of networks was a really key theme of the faculty meeting. And as we were talking there, César, who is I guess you're the coordinator and the content around this meeting, had a couple of really interesting points about how to think about media and the relationship of networks. And so what I'd love to do is to introduce César Hidalgo, who is the owner of the content and the host of this conference, to talk a little bit about sort of some of the ideas that came out of the faculty meeting and talk a little bit about networks and the conference.
Thanks, Joey. So, thank you. So, I'm César Hidalgo. I'm an assistant professor here at the MIT Media Lab. And together with a wonderful network of people, my job was to try to come up with an idea for this conference, a theme, and to help put it together. Now, Joey came to me with this request when I had been at the lab for less than a year, and Joey was brand new. And being young and naive, I said yes. I said, OK, let's try to make a different meeting. And I said yes because actually I thought it was a very interesting challenge. I was new at the place, and being new at the place implied that, I probably knew very little about it. And I wanted to learn more about it. And I wanted to have an excuse to start thinking deeply about what the place meant. So when Joe invited me to host the meeting and I accepted, that got me thinking. And one of the things that got me thinking is about the word media. What does it mean to be at the Media Lab? I used to be like at a physics department, and when you go through airport security and people ask you, what do you do? I'm physics department. Sort of maybe they don't know about quantum mechanics, but they accept it as a valid explanation. But when you say I'm at the Media Lab, you have the challenge to explain it a little bit more. So when I started thinking about the word media, I said, well, there's a lot of ways that people think about this word, a lot of meanings. One of them is about journalism or newsprint. For example, someone in a biology lab is going to think as media as something that you put in a plate in which you're going to grow cells. It's very different meanings of the word. But for me, the thing that kept on coming back to me was this idea of oil on canvas. So when you go to a museum and you see a beautiful painting like this one, what basically you get is a tiny description on the side of it, and that tiny description is going to give you the name of the painting, the name of the artist, maybe the year and the place where it was painted, and it's going to tell media. And it's going to say, in this case, oil on canvas. So it occurred to me that if I were to understand the word media, I had to ask the following question. The question was, what would happen if I would remove the oil and the canvas? What do I get if I remove the oil and the canvas? Now, what is this a media for, then? And if I remove the oil and the canvas, it is very clear there's nothing physical left. There's nothing physical left to the painting. So this must be a media for something non-physical. And then it dawned on me that actually what the media is a vehicle for knowledge. So what oil and canvas are actually embedding here is the perspective that Van Gogh had. It is the technique that he had developed, and the way that he saw the world, and how he was, putting that together in these wonderful compositions. So we can take this idea further, and let me give you another example of how we can think of media in general as vehicles for knowledge. So I'm going to start with a very different character that was not so far in history, which is Michael Faraday. So Michael Faraday, many probably of you have heard of. He was one of the greatest scientists of the 19th century. And he's responsible for helping unify magnetism, electricity, and light. So he built on the work of others, like many great scientists do. For example, he built on the work of Ørsted and Ampere, who had shown that if you take electricity and you put it in a coil, you can actually get a magnetic field. And he was the one that showed that you could do the opposite. You could jiggle a magnet in front of a coil and get electricity out. And that's the main way that we still make electricity. And finally, late in his life, he was able to show that if you take a light beam that is polarized in a certain way and you put a magnet in the right geometry, you can get that to turn. So he was able to join these three different things: magnetism, electricity, and light. But the thing is, he didn't stop there. He also embedded this knowledge into some media. This is Faraday's media. He's the inventor of the electric motor. So Faraday did not only discover the connection between electricity, magnetism, and light, he was also able to put all this together in a device that would make that knowledge, would package that knowledge in a form that can be shared. You can use an electric motor without needing to know Faraday's laws, but by using an electric motor, you're having access to Faraday's laws. Okay? So now, when you think of it that way, every product, everything that makes up our wonderful world can be seen in much more poetic terms. You can think of a vacuum cleaner, as a work of art that, is Faraday's laws, and they're embedded on metal, rubber, and plastic. Or you can think of a harp as Pythagoras' laws on wood and string. You can think of a kitchen blender as, yet another form in which Faraday's laws are mixed with, ideas of mechanical engineering and design to create, this product. So you can think of media as a knowledge vehicle, and this knowledge vehicle can go from the arts to the science to the technology. So now the question becomes, how do you mediate knowledge? How do you get knowledge into the knowledge vehicles? And that's a little bit of like what everyone is trying to do. Either if you're trying to write a book or you're trying to invent something, you're trying to get knowledge into knowledge vehicles. So the first part of this question is a little bit simple, is, well, you first get it into people. To get the knowledge into the knowledge vehicle, you need to get it into people. But there is a problem with this. That is that getting knowledge into people actually is kind of hard. So let me give you an example to try to tell you what I mean by being hard. Assume that you just got an infection on one of your dental nerves. Okay? So your tooth is really aching really bad. Okay? And I'm going to ask you, what would you rather have access to in such situation? Would you rather have access to a nice and well-written article on root canal surgery, or a dentist? Probably you want a dentist, yeah? Because the knowledge matters when it's embedded into the people. It's not knowledge floating around. It's not an article describing, how root canal surgery is performed. It's the idea of root canal surgery and the procedures being internalized in a nervous system of a person that probably took 30 years for that person to accumulate all of that knowledge, to be able to be comfortable enough that you're going to open your mouth and you're going to let them destroy it and rebuild it. Okay? Now, probably you just don't want a dentist. You want a dentist with his or her equipment. Okay? Because obviously the dentist, by using his or her equipment, he's getting access to knowledge on metallurgy, for instance, that was used to build those tools, knowledge on the mechanics of the chair, knowledge on X-rays that was used to, generate the diagnosis. So actually, the dentist is operating at this higher level of knowledge. He's not building his own tools. Why? Because it took him 30 years to become a dentist, from the time that he was born, to the time that he was able to start performing surgery. So therefore, embedding knowledge into people is very hard, and it requires a lot of work. And what that implies is that each one of us can hold very little knowledge. It's a very humbling thought, because the world is very big, and we all can get to know very little, because knowing means being able to know to a level in which you can do it. So that brings us to what I think is one of the most fundamental problems, of our modern world, which is that the modern world requires us to make products and services and to deliver different things that require volumes of knowledge that are really, 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 really large. Okay? But we can fit very little. So I say that the amount of knowledge that we can fit is 1 person byte. So put it like in units of people. We can fit 1 person byte of knowledge, but we have to make products that require people bytes of knowledge. So how do we solve this problem? And the way that I think we solve this problem is by actually modularizing this knowledge, putting it into chunks, and distributing it through networks. This could be firms, they could be organizations, they could be markets. So this actually also gives you a different way of thinking about markets and different way of thinking about the economy. In one way, markets are not what make us richer, are what makes us wiser. The next time that you go to a pharmacy store and you buy a tube of toothpaste, think that you're not buying paste on a tube. What you're actually buying, is access to the knowledge on the synthesis of sodium fluoride that resides in the mind of somewhere, far from you, and that is connected to you through that product. So you're getting access to that person's knowledge. When you buy a bicycle, you're getting access to the knowledge of someone that knows how to cast metal and to shape metal. That's what you're buying access to. So the market is making you wiser, is allowing you to reach and operate at a much higher level of knowledge than the one that you're currently operating. Organizations are what make us smarter because when you modularize and chunk this knowledge, you need to keep it coherent. Like if you put like all pieces that do not match, you're not going to get something out. So you need to have the parts of the knowledge that need to interact the most to be close to each other, to be in organizations that could interact. And that's why organizations have some forms and have some forms that actually are pervasive and that exist throughout the system in different variations. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about is that although this is a very fundamental problem, it's not a problem that we were born with. We were not born into the people-byte age. And if you go back to our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, they lived in a very different world. Our great-great-grandparents actually lived in a world in which the knowledge that exists in society and the knowledge that they were able to hold were not very different. So sure, in a primitive society, they knew about the animals that they hunted, and they knew about which plants were toxic and not toxic, but most people could know most of the things that were to be known. There wasn't a big division of knowledge. But knowledge is very leaky. So in that primitive society, if I found that Joey found a way of making that spear sharper, by like hitting it with a stone in a certain way, probably that knowledge, I'm going to be able to get that knowledge. And now there's two people that know, it's going to start leaking, and eventually knowledge is going to accumulate. So there's this cumulative idea in culture. And then you're going to go into a world in which there are organizations and there are cities that are going to emerge and so forth. And at some point, you're going to keep on accumulating knowledge. You're going to share it with others. You're going to go beyond the person-byte level. But sooner or later, there's going to be so much knowledge that organizations that are these vessels of knowledge are going to start getting full. There's so much knowledge that you can put in an organization. You have an organization with hundreds of thousands of people. Adding another 100,000 people probably doesn't increase the amount of knowledge that you're going to be able to hold by 50%. There are redundancies, people need to communicate, so they're kind of like diminishing effects of like how much information you can actually accumulate in a certain amount of people, in a certain network of people. So I think we're moving into a world in which actually we're beyond the amount of the cognitive limit of an organization. We live in a world in which we are networks of firms, networks of organizations. And let me recap this last thought before I give the stage back to Joey, by summarizing it in this nice curve. It's very conceptual, but the idea is that here you have the total stock of knowledge in the world in the y-axis. And on the x-axis you have time. So from our great-great-great-grandfathers to our children. And knowledge has been increasing all over that period. But there are certain limits which are important. The first one is the limit of a single individual or a person byte, when what we know collectively surpasses what we can actually fit inside our heads. At that point, if you are below that level, if you got new information, you have a very close IP policy. You want to keep it secret. Why? Because that is going to make you king of the tribe. If you find a better way of of killing that deer, or you find a better way of raising those crops, that's going to be very valuable information. But it's very leaky because other people can hold it. But you're going to hit sooner or later a limit in which there's more to know that you can know, and you're going to start having incentives to share that information with others. So you're going to go into a transition of a world of firms. A world of firms in which now organizations are the ones that embed the knowledge, and you have a big incentive for sharing things within your firm, but not outside your firm. Because that other firm could actually embed that knowledge and put it inside their organization as well. But sooner or later, we're going to run out of this capacity as well, and organizations are going to become small, and we're going to go into the network of organizations. And here, it could be that the barriers that we have developed in our previous life, in our previous time in evolution, actually act as friction more than as enabling. And with that thought, I would like to leave Joey, to tell a little bit of what these ideas, what these thoughts means to you, means to us, and means to our interaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Cesar. So one of the things that Nicholas said when I was starting with the Media Lab was that make sure you don't ever think that you're running the place. That you don't tell people what to do, or that you don't say so-and-so works for me. And actually, I'm very familiar with this, because this is how open source projects works. This is how Creative Commons works. This is the world I lived in, where you incentivize, you lead by being a custodian of a process, and you bring in biases that affect the network, but you actually don't order people around. And one of the things that I thought might be helpful, but although slightly vain, is to describe a little bit of my biases so that you get a sense of how my biases may influence or interact with the Media Lab that you know and love. And hopefully it'll turn into a better thing and not a worse thing. So it ties very much with what César just said, because I have been immersed in the world of the networked side, of the stuff that's so complex that companies are forced to share. And I've been thinking about it in the terms of innovation in open networks. And it's, by the way, not that this doesn't work for some things, but for the world that I live in, which is I'm an internet guy. And so I split my life into two pieces, the stuff I did before the internet and the stuff I did after the internet. But there was an amazing battle that happened when the internet was being created. This was actually not called ITU. This used to be called CCITT. But there was an intergovernmental agency, and a variety of them still exists, where you sit around and discuss standards. So big governments and companies would send engineers wearing neckties and experts who are all accredited and sort of have the authority to speak. And they sit around for years and years and years discussing every possible problem, every possible benefit, to create specifications, and even for things that are relatively IT-oriented, stacks this high, that could never be people byte. They are huge organization, multi-billion-dollar projects, and they get contracted into large organizations to produce things like the 3G network and things like that. So when you're building roads and 3G networks and things that require substantial infrastructure without really the ability to change it afterwards, this makes sense. But for things like the internet, it doesn't. And so CCITT created X25, which was their version of the packet network. And a bunch of people at MIT and other institutions created TCP/IP and the modern internet. And they were completely different. Because what they did is they threw that away. And they said, you can participate without asking permission. In fact, all of the small teams that were working on it weren't really professionals necessarily in those fields. And everything was flat. Everyone could participate, but it was a meritocracy. The Internet Engineering Task Force uses this word, rough consensus running code. You just build it and figure it out as we go along. It turns out it's exactly the way it works at the Media Lab. You don't sit around and argue about whether something has merit or not. You just build it, and then building it creates a rigor around which you can develop things. Sometimes we get things wrong, like we run out of IP addresses or we didn't anticipate spam. But overall, the internet has evolved in a way that makes it clear that it was okay that it wasn't planned, and it was actually agile, and it won against those planned networks. And so it's become somewhat of a religion to me, this idea that you don't have to know the whole of it. And the other thing that emerged, which is interesting, was a stack of open standards that are run by non-governmental agencies. These are relatively small nonprofits who create the standards that run the internet or run the web, and the organization that I ran, Creative Commons, which is creating interoperability at the copyright and content layer. But what this did was it allowed, so you literally have teenagers participating in all of these things, creating the code. And what happens is that by allowing, again, many of you are probably too young for this, but I remember when you had to have government permission to connect anything to the phone network, like your modem. There was no permission. You had to have permission to innovate. This is a network where you don't have to have permission to innovate. And what that did was it allowed competitors like 3Com and Cisco and all these people to disrupt the traditional models, and it did several things. So because of Moore's Law, you had the computer getting cheaper, but you also had the cost of communication and collaboration and distribution get so cheap that I think it fundamentally changed the nature of innovation. And so David Weinberger uses this phrase, small pieces loosely joined. So if you look at all of the great innovations on the internet, they're typically small pieces. The browser, the FTP client, TCP/IP, they're all done by small groups of people, many times students, who have created these things. And there's a key philosophy of the internet, which is you don't try to know the whole of it. You do your thing, you connect with others, and you hope that what you create is used in ways that you didn't anticipate, which is exactly the opposite of the other way, which was to try to anticipate every single use of it so you knew how you were going to deal with it. So it's a very different kind of philosophy. And the other part is it's really important, again, this gets to the planning things, as things become so complex, and getting to César's map of all this information, in a world of complexity, the map doesn't work anymore. The cost of creating a map, I worked so much with large Japanese firms at least, is often we get to this point where the feasibility study costs more than the project. And that's actually a really big problem. And so today I feel like the compass is what you need, the trajectory of what we're doing at the Media Lab and other things, but not the specific what do we do today, tomorrow. So I think that the idea of trying to create a map is kind of outdated now. You need a very good compass. So this is kind of what my brain was like when I was working with the larger corporations in my background, where we all talked about the downside. What was the risk of overrun of the budget? What if this failed? And the upside was somewhat incremental revenue. It's like, can we increase our margins? How can we increase our market share? And again, this is sort of generalizing and maybe overcharacterizing this, but a substantial part of the management of the companies I was involved in, our brains looked like this. We were focused mostly on downside. When I started switching to the internet model, this is kind of how our brains were like. So the average cost of a startup, because of those efficiencies that we were having in the cost of collaboration, and now with open source, you actually don't have to build everything. You can get most of the stuff from the network and build these things like Twitter and Flickr in days. And so the average investment to go from an idea to a startup went from about $10 million about a decade ago to probably about $0 or $10,000 today. My average investment is about $100,000. So when you invest $100,000, it turns out that it costs more money to try to figure out how to recoup it when it's failing than it is to just let it go. The most you will ever lose on a $100,000 VC investment is $100,000. And so if it costs you $300,000 to think about it, then you shouldn't do it. So most VCs sit around trying to figure out what is the home run company, my portfolio, and how do I make it better? So it's very much on trying to amplify the winners and just letting the losers go. But if you look at, say, open source software, 99.9% of open source projects, say, on SourceForge, they don't have any activity. But it's that less than 1% that become the Linuxes and the Firefoxes and things like that. And if somebody told you, I'm going to make a website that anybody can edit, and it's going to become better than better than Encyclopedia Britannica, you would never fund this in your company. It costs nothing to try it, and some of those things become successes. And so it's a very different way of thinking about innovation when you have a very low cost of failure. You just do it. You don't sit around and talk about it. And again, what's really interesting as I get into the Media Lab is this is very much the DNA of the Media Lab that Nicholas designed. And so, and we've got the father of this word that I love, the power of pull, which is really, when we're in these networks, what we do is, instead of stocking lots of information and assets and money and IP, and then pushing it and centrally planning it, which is somewhat of the old way of doing it, it turns out that the ability to find the stuff that you need, the ability to connect it together, and the filtering mechanism so that you can actually route to the resources that you need are so good that you can just pull the resources as you need them. And this dramatically increases your agility. Because I so often find companies who want to pivot to a new thing, but they don't want to throw away the million lines of code they just wrote last week. Or we have this intellectual property, can't we use it? And YouTube was a dating site with video when it started. PayPal was a mobile app. So if you imagine that they had a plan and they kept going, they would not have been successful. It's the ability to kind of be aware of where you are and to be agile and pull resources as you need it. And so it's really about embracing serendipity, too. Because if you sit and have a plan, if you plan everything, you can't get lucky. And you really, really need to get lucky. And the thing is, it's not just random. It's about who you surround yourself with, and it leads to the power of pull. It's to be able to be, like Nicholas said, heads up and aware enough so that when you see an opportunity, you're able to grab it. And that has two things. You have to have your antennas out and your eyes open, but you also not be encumbered by a bunch of plans and assets that actually turn out to be liabilities. So embracing serendipity, and how do you because serendipity is very different from random. And some people may think that the Media Lab may look slightly random at the beginning, but what we are is a serendipity engine, and you're part of it. And so now I want you to indulge me in telling a little story, because this will describe what this kind of pull thing looks like. There's a very interesting random serendipitous thing, which was the interview that I had where I convinced myself I wanted to be at the Media Lab, and I also convinced the Media Lab that it wanted to be with me, was actually March 11th, where the earthquake happened. So it was a night between the 2 days of the meeting. So it was a very weird set of meetings. When I saw Professor Ishii, we were sitting there staring at the news as we were conducting the interview. But one of the key things that was happening is I was sitting here in Boston, is I was communicating with some of my friends. So I had a friend in LA, I had a friend in Tokyo. They're both here at this conference. We're saying, okay, we need to figure out what to do with our families. We don't have any Geiger counters. We don't have any data. What's going on? What should we do? And Peter's a hardware hacker, and Sean is a web hacker. And so Sean found a bunch of kids that were doing data visualization around the radiation measurements, but they didn't have a lot of science. So I was able, through a politician, I got in touch with a guy who did the instrumentation of 3 Mile Island and was the expert in measuring radiation around nuclear fallout. And I talked to Jun Murai, who's the father of the Japanese internet, who connected me into all the academics in Japan, as well as his environmental sensor network. I knew Bunny Huang, who was the Media Lab graduate, who's, I think, the best hardware guy around. And then we connected with the hacker spaces in LA and Tokyo to get the hardware hackers starting to work on this idea. We got Han from IDEO, actually. She was doing the best visualizations of the mapping that we had seen. And we started pulling these people in into a network. And this is literally days. And then after about a week, we had a huge network of people, and probably, arguably, the best group of experts around this. And we had a group doing hardware, a group doing software. We had a group doing architecture, deploying things on the ground. And we were using just random tools like Skype. We had a Skype channel going on all the time, email, and so on. But within a month, we had all these people. So in this room, you have Ray Ozzie, who's used to be the everybody knows Ray Ozzie, but he wanted to participate because he wanted to think about the architecture of how the data should be. We have this guy who is the guy who did the 3 Mile Island instrumentation, and we've got the head of the hacker spaces, and we've got the father of the Japanese internet. We're all sitting in a room powwowing about how this thing would work. And this is all ad hoc. This is exactly pull and serendipity. And some people say, well, maybe it's just your political capital. It wasn't about capital. It was that it was the right idea at the right time, pulled all these people together, and the network worked, but the physical ability to convene was very important. So the second meeting we had at the Media Lab, and which was fascinating because it turns out one of the greatest things about the Media Lab is, people call me scatterbrained and interested in everything, and what are you doing? It turns out that every single thing I'm interested in, there's somebody at the Media Lab who's more interested and better at it. And so whenever I bring any group into the Media Lab, I find that there are so many points of interaction that it becomes a thing here. And so this is us sharing with the Media Lab. But anyway, so what happened was it turns out there aren't enough Geiger counters. The reason there aren't enough Geiger counters is there aren't enough sensors. So we wanted to collect massive amounts of data, so we put together this BGeigy, which stands for bento, and we put it on cars and we drove around, and we mobilized local volunteers, and we created these massive maps that show all kinds of information that we'll do in a separate on-conference, but really revealed a lot of mismanagement as well as problems in the system. We also showed that as we go into the exclusion zone, that it's actually less radiation in the exclusion zone as outside in some cases, and people were being relocated from low radiation to higher radiation. And one of the key things, though this is with my Creative Commons hat, is I put all the data under a CC0 dedication, which means that everyone can share it. So we have 600,000 data points that anyone can use without any copyright restrictions. It's the largest data set of radiation measurements in the world. But what we don't have is we need to map onto that the every bloody nose that happens, and all of the other data, we need to do data science. And so Sandy Pentland at the Media Lab is doing amazing work on data analysis and privacy. But the fundamental problem here is that because people aren't opening up, we find research labs in Japan and all over the place, they collect their own data and they publish the results. But they don't realize that the data needs to be collected in order to do data science. And so one of the key things that I have a bias for is interoperability of data as well as interoperability of the network. And again, I'll talk more about this in some of the unconferences. And finally, Bonnie created probably the best designed Geiger counter in the world. Because it turns out that there was a real spike in Geiger counter designs right around Chernobyl, and another spike of interest in Geiger counters around 3 Mile Island. This big Fukushima thing is creating a huge interest in Geiger counters. The key thing for Bunny's design is we are now publishing it on the internet in a completely open design. So open hardware is a very key thing. And I believe that hardware Just like software and the internet created this extremely low cost of creating startups through sharing of software, I think that the fab stuff that we're doing downstairs at Neil's place and a lot of the work we're doing inside of the Media Lab is creating the ability to create hardware and share hardware designs very similar to the way that it's working in software. And Bunny, who's spent all of his time on the factories floors in China, realized that the whole manufacturing is changing. So I think there's an explosion of innovation that's going to happen around open hardware, and that the Media Lab is very well positioned to be the leaders of that. So to think about how I'm hoping that we can integrate some of this new thinking into where the Media Lab might go. Of course, we're going to continue to do a lot of the things that we're great at, but some of the things that I'd like to add is, in addition to focusing on products, getting back to César's thing, I think more and more we're going to start thinking about ecosystems. And as we do these on conferences, really start focusing less on trying to figure out, okay, what does this particular thing do in isolation as a product on the shelf in some store here, but think about how can we create ecosystems and how do all of you members participate in these ecosystems. Part of it is by, and again, I don't think this is intentional, but when you have this wonderful building and all these smart people, you tend to have everything you need here. You can build just about anything in the Media Lab. But from the outside, what happens is it starts to look like a container. And so one of the things I think that's really important as we plug into the network is to turn the Media Lab into a platform. And so one of the things, for instance, you'll notice is we've invited more people to this meeting than in the past, and we're streaming it. And so making the Media Lab more open and look more like a platform. And one of the key things is we're going to stop using the word sponsor and start using the word member, because it's great that you guys give us money, but it's more important that you participate in what I think is the design of this ecosystem and the design of this community. And I've done a lot of work with nonprofits, and if you kind of raise money over here to do program over here, and then you report once a year, and it becomes a somewhat transactional relationship, I think it's much better to work together. What are we doing together? Feel like a family, and have that discussion. And it also, instead of having it just hub and spoke, where we're working with each of you, so the member benefit of us being very multidisciplinary, but you are all also content. So selling each other to yourselves, I think, is really important. So this idea that you're members and you're participating is key. And so these are just some specific things. So we started a Media Lab blog, which we're working on making it better. It's Creative Commons licensed, which is the first sort of Creative Commons licensed stuff at the Media Lab. Creative Commons license means that you can use it without asking permission as long as you provide attribution. This is what the TED videos, for instance, use as a Creative Commons license. So TED used to be a really interesting thing that no one actually on the outside knew what happened there. Now it's become somewhat of a thing that you point to whenever you want to point to something smart. We should be involved in that. Open data, as I said, I think this is a key initiative. It's going to require a lot of standardization and a lot of neutral, safe spots for people to talk about this stuff, and I think an academic institution is key for that. Innovation around IP. So this is, we don't have any conclusions, but we're convening an IP commission to think about how can we use intellectual property to spur innovation. It often does, but doesn't always. So we're trying to figure out how we can make our IP policy more flexible. We'll be streaming our talks more often, so we're starting a lecture series, but this conference and this plenary, all of this will be streamed online, and you can see already people are watching and commenting on my comments on Twitter. So we're in the open now, which is kind of a new image. And then the member meetings, we're going to, again, this is the first one, but we'll be iterating on them and trying to make them more open. There are actually journalists amongst us now. And so in a way, not all of the meetings, this main room is on the record. We'll describe this to you more carefully later. But a lot of the comments that we're making are actually in the open. And so with that, before I hand it off to César to talk a little bit more about the specifics of the meeting, I first of all just wanted to welcome our new lab members. You're joining at the same time that I'm joining, so it's kind of a transition phase. But I'd love to have you give us a lot of feedback, but have the other members welcome these new members. And we also have some prospective members as well. Many of these are new friends, some of them are old friends, but these are companies who are going to be participating, who are considering joining the Media Lab. But if everyone could make them feel at home. And with that, I will hand it off to César to talk a little bit more about the meeting itself. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Joy, for that beautiful speech. Now I'm going to talk about something much more simpler. It's much more pedestrian. I'm going to talk a little bit about like the theme of the meeting and what you should expect during the next couple of days. So it's a little bit of an orientation. The theme of this meeting is networks understanding networks. That's a wonderful phrase. Andy Lippman actually came up with that phrase, and I like it. And the way that I explain it a little bit is that we are networks. We're networks of cells. We're networks of, and by cells I mean it could be neurons, but also there's, our nervous system, and our immune system is a network of cells that interact. We're networks of genes, so we're, this complex and intricate system. So we are networks, and we form networks. Okay? So we're networks ourselves, and we form networks. We form society, we form the economy, we form the social interactions that we participate. And a little bit of the idea of this meeting is to celebrate how we, the networks that we are, understand the networks that we form. Okay? Now, because of this, we wanted to create a meeting with networks in mind, and we have developed like a few different things to try to help the networking and to bring technology into the networking. So 2 things are on conferences and research open house, and that are things that actually Joe is going to talk a little bit more at 11 a.m. in an orientation session. So I'm just going to mention them that they're going to be networking opportunities. But there is this other application that I want to name that is Charmy, that it was developed by Catherine Havasi and Victor Wang from the Digital Intuition Group. And the idea of Charmy is this application is kind of like a like in Facebook, but for the real world. Okay? So you're going to be able to like this talk, if you would have had the application now. You're going to be able to like the talks that come after, or charm the talks that come after. You're going to be able to charm the projects that you're going to see, the demonstrations that the students see. You're going to be able to check into the conference sessions that are going to go. And by providing us with all of that data, we're going to give you something back. We're going to help you build your trip report, because you're going to have sort of basically what you're going to have is you're going to have like a list of all the things that you have visited, but there is more than that. You're not going to only have been collecting the information, because this is linked to a digital layer in which is the glass infrastructure, in which this information has already been organized. Is we're going to also be able to give you an idea of maybe who would be a person that has been liking the same things, had been charming the same things, and could be an interesting person for you to connect with. Okay? So this Charmy application is going to give you a possibility of finding other people that has similar tastes, and is going to recommend them to you, and it's going to tell you where they were seen most recently. So actually it's going to tell you, this person, the last time that it was seen was next to this demo at 3 p.m. Okay? If you're checking into the application. Now, obviously you need to have this. You can use it on your laptop. You can use it on your on your phone. You can use it on your tablet, and you can download it, by using this QR reader. So I would recommend, first of all, the ones that have a QR reader, I'll give them like 20 seconds to actually, because we're good in time, to take the QR reader out. You can actually, get the application in right now with this gigantic QR. And while you do that, I'm going to recommend the ones that do not have a QR reader to actually get one. They are free, they're everywhere, and the QR reader is kind of like an easy way to have a link between, something physical and something digital. It's a way for like the computer to communicate, with the physical devices more quickly. So then now you see we had a spike on the subscriptions to the application. So, okay. So that's one of the layers that we have. Another thing that I wanted to mention is actually the way that we have structured the meeting. So many of you have been to meetings before. There are others that this is the first meeting. In previous meetings, there was a lot of presentations. And here we have tried to maximize more of opportunities for people to network. So this is sort of like how your day is going to look like. We started at 8:30. We must be like somewhere around here. And this is where it's going to end. This is kind of like think of it as a clock that goes between 8:30 a.m. and 7 p.m. All of the blue is going to be actual presentations. So we're kind of like almost done with this morning session. We're like halfway there. And that's how much we're going to have you guys sitting on this stage, and we're going to be presenting content to you. But you're going to be participants in this meeting, and we're taking that seriously. So there's like 2 different instances in which you're going to have to interact. One of it is the yellow, which represents roughly 30% of the meeting, and that's what I call like social networking. It is, lunch, coffee break, receptions. Those are opportunities that you're going to have to interact with other people and do networking as usual. But there's also this structured networking. And this is the research open house, and these are the conferences. These are opportunities for you to interact with people and their projects, to have the conversations that you want to have with whom you want to have. So there is actually a lot of time in the conference devoted for you to participate, for you to put topics of conversation, for you to be, like a true participant of the event, not a passive participant. Tomorrow it looks relatively similar. Now I want to talk a little bit about the program. So we have 3 invited speakers. The first invited speaker is Ricardo Hausmann. He's the director for Harvard Center for International Development. And he used to be a chief economist at the Inter-American Development Bank during the 90s, and a minister in Venezuela before the current president was the president of Venezuela. Ricardo, he's a seasoned economist. He's author of a variety of books. And he's going to be talking about how to infer what countries know from what they produce and why it matters. So in a way, how do you measure the number of people bytes that a country has and why that matters? Yeah? So it's very connected to what we talked in the morning. And the next speaker that we have, the next invited speaker, is going to be Laszlo Barabasi. That is going to be today at 4:45 p.m. He's the author of Link. Laszlo has, been one of the most cited scientists from the last decade, and he has been behind a big growth in what is the science of networks. And he's going to be giving like a talk about the science of networks in general, from the web to the cell. And tomorrow our last invited speaker is going to be Nicholas Christakis. He's a professor of sociology at Harvard and also a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. And he's going to be talking actually about networks and evolution. His talk is titled The Evolutionary Significance of Human Social Networks. And now in the next session, what we're going to have is we're going to have 2 talks that go from basically the micro aspect of networks to the macro aspect of networks. We have Ed Boyden. Ed Boyden, he leads the synthetic neurobiology group. And he's going to be talking to us about how actually do you go from a network of scientists to a network of knowledge. Okay? And we're going to have Sandy Pendant after Ed talking about, like the macro things. Sandy deals a lot with like big data. He's like a big data guru, and he's going to be talking about networks from that different perspective. So with that, I would like just to finish with one more thought. The theme of this meeting is networks understanding networks. And I think that one thought that crystallizes the importance of networks very well is this one. Is that anything that is worth doing cannot be done alone. And with that, I would like to welcome you to the fall event of 2011. Thanks.